The events of that cold December night in 2019 are still etched into my memory with a chilling clarity. As a 31-year-old stay-at-home mother, my daily life was a whirlwind of responsibilities and the constant needs of two young children. Those late-night hours, specifically after 8:30 p.m., were my only sanctuary, a precious sliver of time where I could reclaim my identity, enjoy a quiet drive, and handle errands without the chaotic soundtrack of motherhood. I pulled into the parking lot of the Target I frequented most. Now, I've never been someone who suffers from irrational anxiety, but I've always believed in being prepared. Back in college, I attended several seminars on human trafficking, and I've spent years researching how to identify red flags and situational awareness. I'm the kind of person who carries self-defense tools and never enters a building without a plan. That night, I parked strategically, right in front of the entrance, next to a cart return, and did a quick mental scan of every vehicle around me. The lot was unusually quiet for a weekday, which I initially welcomed as a sign of a peaceful shopping trip. I walked through the sliding glass doors, grabbed a cart, and let the rhythmic hum of the store's fluorescent lights settle my mind. I had been browsing for barely 10 minutes when the first ripple of unease hit me. I turned into a main aisle and spotted him, a young man, perhaps in his mid-20s, tall and gaunt. He was wearing a grimy gray two-piece tracksuit and heavy brown work boots. As we crossed paths, I offered a polite, reflexive smile and a quiet hello. He didn't respond. Instead, he stared back with a hollow, vacant expression, eyes that looked right through me as if he were under the influence of something heavy. What struck me as truly odd wasn't just his appearance, but the fact that he was wandering the aisles with his hands buried deep in his pockets, devoid of a shopping cart, a basket, or a single item. I tried to shake it off, telling myself he was just an eccentric shopper, but the feeling of being watched began to crawl up my spine. As I moved to a different department, my heart skipped a beat. There, standing near the end of the aisle, was a second man. He was younger than the first, but the realization hit me like a physical blow. He was wearing the exact same gray tracksuit and the same heavy brown work boots. Like his companion, he had no cart and no intention of shopping. The moment our eyes met, he jerked his head away, a calculated move to avoid a direct confrontation. At this point, my adrenaline began to spike. Coincidences happen, but identical outfits and identical suspicious behavior in a near-empty store felt like a coordinated hunt. 15 minutes later, the third member appeared, an older man, perhaps the leader of the group. He too was clad in the gray tracksuit and brown boots, pacing the store with his hands in his pockets. I realized then that I wasn't just being followed, I was being mapped. Every time I changed departments, one of them would materialize nearby, subtly signaling my position to the others. Determined to confirm my worst fears, I began a series of stress tests. I started moving through the store in a completely nonsensical pattern. I would enter a toy aisle, walk halfway down, and then abruptly double back. I circled the clothing section 3 times. Without fail, one of the 3 men would appear at the opposite end of the aisle or cross my path within seconds. They had stopped trying to be discreet. They wanted me to know they were there. They wanted me to feel the weight of their presence. The store, which usually felt like a safe, brightly lit haven, suddenly felt like a labyrinth with no exits. As I finally made a break for the checkout lanes, my heart was hammering against my ribs. I could feel the heat of someone approaching rapidly from behind. I didn't wait for them to reach me. I spun around suddenly to face my pursuer. It was the first man I had seen. Up close, the darkness in his eyes was terrifying, a complete lack of empathy. A slow, mocking smirk spread across his face. He didn't say a word, but as he passed, he intentionally slammed his shoulder into mine, a final act of intimidation. He then walked out the exit, but he did so while walking backward, keeping his predatory gaze locked on mine until the doors slid shut. I was shaking violently as I reached the service desk. I demanded to see the manager immediately. When I described the men in their coordinated outfits, the manager's face went pale. She admitted that other staff members had noticed them and felt an overwhelming sense of dread. She called for a young male employee to escort me to my car. As we stepped out into the chilly night air, my instincts were vindicated in the most horrifying way possible. Parked directly behind my car, so close that it would have been difficult to back out, was a white, high-roofed cargo van with no side windows. One man was in the driver's seat, while the other two were leaning against the side, eyes fixed on my driver's side door. They were waiting for me to walk out alone. The moment I pointed them out to the employee, the two men scrambled into the van and the driver floored it, tires screeching as they vanished into the darkness. I drove home in a state of shock, my doors locked and my eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror. Days later, local news reports surfaced about attempted abductions in nearby shopping centers involving similar descriptions. I realized that night that I wasn't just a shopper, I was a target, and if I hadn't listened to that small, screaming voice of intuition, my story might have ended very differently. Working as a pizza delivery driver is often seen as a mundane job, a way for students or young adults to make some extra cash. But for a 19-year-old girl working the late shift in a quiet town, the darkness of the road often carries a weight that others don't see. I had been doing this for a while, and I generally felt safe. I knew the neighborhoods, I knew the shortcuts, and I knew how to handle difficult customers. But nothing in my training or experience could have prepared me for that Tuesday night. It was around 10:30 p.m., the kind of night where the air is thick with a chilling fog. The shop was about to close when a last-minute order came in. Usually, we'd be annoyed, but it was a large order, 3 family-sized pizzas and several sides. I took the warming bags, jumped into my car, and followed the GPS to an area of town I wasn't very familiar with. The houses here were spaced far apart, hidden behind overgrown hedges and ancient towering trees. As I pulled into the driveway of the address, my headlights flickered across a dilapidated house that looked like it hadn't seen a coat of paint in decades. There were no lights on in the front, no welcome mat, just a cold, oppressive silence. I checked the order again. "Deliver to the side door," the instructions read. My gut gave a slight tug, a warning I should have listened to, but I told myself I was just being jumpy because of the dark. I grabbed the heavy bags, gripped my flashlight, and stepped out into the biting cold, unaware that I was walking directly into a carefully laid trap. I walked down a narrow, cracked stone path leading to the side of the house. The side door was heavy oak, scarred with deep scratches. I knocked, and for a long minute there was no sound from within. I was just about to turn back and call the customer when the door creaked open. Standing there was a man in his late 40s, wearing a stained undershirt and a look of forced politeness that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ah, the pizza. Come in," he said, stepping back into a dimly lit kitchen. I hesitated. Rule number 1 of delivery: never enter the house. "I'm sorry, sir, I'm not allowed to come inside," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. "Nonsense. It's freezing out there, and I have the money on the counter. My hands are full with these dogs." I looked down and saw 2 massive, growling Dobermans sitting perfectly still behind him. They weren't barking. They were staring at me like I was prey. Yielding to the pressure and wanting to get the transaction over with, I took a small, fateful step inside. The air in the house smelled of copper and old dust. As I set the pizzas down on the cluttered counter, I heard a sickening thud. The man had closed the door behind me and turned the deadbolt.
My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. When I turned around, the polite man was gone. In his place stood someone whose face had contorted into a mask of pure, calculated malice. He wasn't reaching for his wallet. He was reaching for a heavy set of zip ties on the table.
"You're not going anywhere," he whispered, his voice devoid of any human emotion. The dogs stood up, their low growls vibrating in the small room. In that split second, the seminars I had attended and the survival instincts I didn't know I possessed kicked in. I didn't scream. I knew no one would hear me in this isolated fortress. Instead, I used the only weapon I had, the heavy thermal pizza bag. As he lunged toward me, I swung the bag with all my strength, catching him off guard and hitting him square in the face. The hot steam and the weight of the remaining sides disoriented him for a second. I didn't wait. I dived toward the door, fumbling frantically with the deadbolt. I could hear his heavy boots thundering on the linoleum behind me. One of the dogs snapped at my heels, tearing my jeans, but the adrenaline made me numb to the pain. I managed to wrench the door open and sprinted toward my car. I didn't look back. I threw myself into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and peeled out of the driveway so fast the tires left burn marks on his gravel. I drove straight to the police station, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold the steering wheel. When the police raided the house an hour later, they didn't just find a man who wanted free pizza. They found a basement reinforced with soundproof padding and a collection of trophies from victims who hadn't been as lucky or as fast as I was. He was a predator who used delivery apps as a hunting ground. That night changed me forever. I quit that job the next day, and I never, ever enter a stranger's house again, no matter how cold it is outside. At 24 years old, I felt like I had the world at my feet. I had just graduated from the police academy and started my career as a patrol officer. Being young, fit, and perhaps a bit too confident in my ability to handle any situation, I didn't think twice about diving into the world of online dating. That's how I met Elena. Her profile was perfect. Striking photos, a witty bio, and an energy that seemed to jump off the screen. We swiped right, and within days we were talking for hours every night. She told me she was new to the area and felt a bit overwhelmed by the city. She suggested we meet for our first date somewhere quiet, a place where we could actually talk. "There's this beautiful scenic overlook about 30 minutes outside the city," she texted. "It's a bit off the beaten path, but the view of the valley at night is incredible." Looking back, every alarm bell in my head should have been ringing. As a cop, I was trained to recognize isolation as a primary tactic for predators. But I wasn't a cop that night. I was just a guy looking for a connection. I agreed to meet her there at 9 p.m. I hopped into my truck, feeling a mix of excitement and nerves. The drive took me deep into the countryside, away from the streetlights and the safety of the suburbs. The roads turned from asphalt to gravel, and the trees began to close in around me like tall, dark sentinels. My GPS signaled that I had arrived at a small dirt turnout overlooking a pitch-black ravine. Elena's car, a silver sedan, was already there. My headlights swept across her vehicle, and for a split second I thought I saw shadows moving inside, but I dismissed it as a trick of the light. I parked my truck and stepped out. The air was unnervingly still. Elena got out of her car, looking exactly like her photos. She smiled and waved, but she didn't walk toward me. Instead, she stayed near the edge of the ravine, gesturing for me to join her. "The view is this way," she called out. Her voice sounded strained, almost rehearsed. As I started to walk toward her, my cop brain suddenly jolted awake. I noticed that her car's engine was still running and the trunk was slightly unlatched. My hand instinctively reached for my waistband, where I carried my off-duty weapon. Before I could take another step, the back doors of her sedan flew open. 3 men, dressed in dark hoodies and masks, erupted from the car. 2 of them were brandishing heavy metal pipes, and the third had something that glinted like a blade in the moonlight. Elena didn't scream. She didn't look surprised. She simply stepped back and watched with cold, calculating eyes. This wasn't a date. It was an execution. "Get on the ground! Give us the keys!" one of them barked. They were closing the distance fast. In that moment, time slowed down. They expected a terrified victim, a civilian who would freeze and plead for mercy. They had no idea they had just tried to ambush a trained police officer who was armed and ready to fight back. I drew my service weapon in one fluid motion, the metal cold and reassuring in my grip. "Police, drop the weapons, get on the ground now," I bellowed with every ounce of authority I had. The transformation in their demeanor was instantaneous. The sheer shock of seeing a barrel pointed back at them broke their resolve. The 2 with the pipes dropped them immediately, the metal clanging loudly against the gravel. The 3rd man tripped over his own feet as he scrambled back toward the car. Elena's face went from cold to sheer terror in a heartbeat. They realized they hadn't caught a lamb. They had walked into a lion's den. I kept them covered while I backed away toward my truck, using it as cover while I dialed dispatch on my cell. Within 10 minutes, the quiet valley was flooded with the blue and red strobe lights of 6 squad cars. My colleagues arrived in force, and the suspects were tackled and handcuffed before they could even think of escaping. But the real horror came during the search of their vehicle. When the officers popped the trunk of Elena's sedan, they didn't find stolen wallets or electronics. They found a heavy-duty plastic tarp, rolls of duct tape, a bottle of industrial-strength bleach, and a collection of jagged knives. But the most chilling discovery was a small, blood-stained digital camera. Upon later inspection, the camera contained footage of other dates, men who hadn't been armed, men who hadn't been trained, men who had never made it home. I sat on the tailgate of my truck, watching the tow truck pull their car away. I had survived, but the realization that I had almost become another video in their collection haunted me. I never used a dating app again. To this day, whenever I see a scenic overlook, I don't see the view. I see the darkness that hides just beyond the headlights.